What do you do after 239 days away from basketball? For most players, the answer is simple. You try to survive the first few minutes. You test your legs, search for your timing, and hope the game slows down before the rust becomes obvious. You do not walk back onto an international floor and start tearing through records that had survived every era before you. You do not come off the bench, play just 19 minutes, and instantly force the entire sport to reframe what a return is supposed to look like. And you definitely do not do all of that while carrying the kind of pressure Caitlin Clark was carrying, with every camera locked in, every possession dissected, and every reaction waiting to become a headline. But that is exactly why this story matters. Because what happened in Puerto Rico was not just a hot shooting night. It was not just a feel-good comeback story. And it was not simply another example of a star player doing star player things. What happened over those 7 days felt bigger than a tournament, bigger than a box score, and bigger than even the records themselves. It felt like a moment that exposed something deeper about women's basketball, about Team USA, and about the way Caitlin Clark keeps forcing the game to move at her speed, whether the system is ready or not. That is what made the whole thing so hard to ignore. Going into this tournament, the tone around Clark's return was careful, controlled, almost overly cautious. She had not played competitive basketball in 239 days. That number alone was enough to shape the conversation. 239 days is not a normal break. It is not a minor pause. It is not one of those short absences where a great player can stay in rhythm through light workouts and still step back in without much damage. That kind of layoff changes things. It chips away at timing. It interrupts instincts. It creates doubt, not just in the minds of fans and analysts, but sometimes in the player too. Even the best in the world can come back looking half a step slow after that much time away. And at the highest level, half a step can make the difference between control and chaos. So when Clark arrived in Puerto Rico, the assumption from a lot of people was obvious. Ease her in. Limit the minutes. Watch the body language. Lower the expectations, at least for the first game or two. Let her find the flow again. Let her rebuild the rhythm. Let her adjust. That sounds reasonable. It even sounds smart. The problem is that Caitlin Clark has spent most of her basketball life making reasonable expectations look outdated the second the ball goes up. Because while the outside world was talking about caution, minutes limits, and recovery timelines, Clark was talking like someone who had no interest in returning quietly. Not recklessly. Not emotionally. Just confidently. Like somebody who knew exactly who she was, exactly what she could still do, and exactly how little time she would need before it all started looking familiar again. There was no panic in the way she spoke. No dramatic buildup. No attempt to protect herself from criticism if the first game looked rough. What came through instead was something much more revealing. Relief. Gratitude. Excitement. The energy of a player who had been forced away from the game long enough to remember how much she loved every part of it. And that matters, because not every comeback begins from the same emotional place. Some returns are built on fear. Fear of re-injury. Fear of disappointment. Fear that the version of yourself people remember might not be the version that shows up now. Some returns are tentative because the athlete is still negotiating with their own body, still waiting for real contact, real pace, real pressure to tell them whether everything is truly back. But Clark did not step into this tournament like someone negotiating. She stepped into it like someone reclaiming something. That is what made the first impression so powerful. Before she even checked in, the atmosphere already felt different. The crowd knew who they were watching. Her teammates knew what her presence meant. The buzz was there before the first touch, before the first shot, before the first pass. And that alone says something important. Even after 239 days away, Clark did not enter this event like just another talented player rejoining a roster. She entered it like a gravitational force. People were waiting, not just to see whether she could contribute, but to see whether she could shift the temperature of the entire game the moment her shoes hit the floor. Then she did. And once that happened, the whole conversation changed. Because this was supposed to be the careful comeback, the managed return, the gradual re-entry into serious competition. Instead, it turned into something that looked almost absurd in real time. A player away from the game for nearly 8 months checks in off the bench and immediately starts controlling pace, creating shots, bending defenders, and turning ordinary possessions into something sharper, faster, and more dangerous. The ball moved differently. The spacing looked cleaner. The floor seemed wider. Teammates started getting touches in better spots. Defenders started reacting instead of anticipating. And within minutes, it no longer looked like a player testing the waters. It looked like the game had been waiting for her to return to its center. That is the part people miss when they reduce this story to stats. Yes, the stats were outrageous. Yes, the records were real. Yes, the tournament ended with numbers that sound almost exaggerated when you say them out loud. But the deeper story was visible even before the record book caught up. You could see it in the rhythm of the offense. You could see it in the way possessions stopped feeling ordinary when she was involved. You could see it in the simple fact that a player with that long of a layoff did not look like she was searching for comfort. She looked like she was restoring order. And once that started happening, the records almost became inevitable. That is where this return stops being a normal sports story and becomes something much harder to ignore. Because it is one thing to come back and play well. Great players do that sometimes. It is another thing to come back and instantly produce the kind of impact that makes coaches rethink their choices, makes fans question why the role was limited in the first place, and makes the broader basketball world realize that the gap between good return and historic statement can apparently be crossed in under 20 minutes if the player is Caitlin Clark. And make no mistake, that is exactly what Puerto Rico became, a statement. Not just about talent, because everyone already knew she had that. Not just about toughness, because fighting through setbacks is already part of every serious athlete's story. This was a statement about scale, about how large her influence becomes the second she is back in live competition, about how quickly she can tilt a floor, an offense, a tournament, and even the broader conversation around women's basketball once she is given even a small window to operate. The comeback itself was impressive. The speed of the takeover was what made it startling. That is why this tournament hit different from the beginning. It was not merely about Team USA winning games they were expected to win. It was not just about one roster being deeper or more talented than another. It was about the collision between expectation and reality. The expectation was patience. The reality was explosion. The expectation was that Clark might need time. The reality was that the event itself seemed to speed up around her. The expectation was that this would be a nice return story. The reality was that it became a historical one before the first game had even fully settled. And once you understand that, the rest of the tournament looks different too. Because now the question is no longer whether Caitlin Clark came back successfully. That question died almost immediately. The real question is what her return revealed. What it revealed about how much of the game she can control. What it revealed about how limited certain coaching decisions started to look once her impact became undeniable. What it revealed about Team USA's best offensive identity when the ball is in her hands. And maybe most importantly, what it revealed about the next phase of women's basketball when its most magnetic offensive engine is healthy, active, and once again forcing everyone else to respond. That is why this is bigger than 1 week. In 7 days, Clark did not just remind people who she was. She reminded them how quickly she can make old assumptions feel small. She reminded them that absence can build anticipation, but it can also sharpen perspective. When a player is gone that long, people start filling the silence with theories. Maybe the comeback will be slow. Maybe the rhythm will be off. Maybe the edge will take time to return. Maybe the international game will demand a softer landing. Puerto Rico erased those theories one possession at a time. And when it was over, the numbers were only part of the reason people could not stop talking about it. The other part was the feeling, the unmistakable sense that something had shifted. That this was not simply a player returning to basketball, but a player reasserting herself at the exact moment the sport was already debating who drives it, who defines it, and who its future truly belongs to. A lot of players can win games. A smaller number can put up historic lines. But only a few can make one short tournament feel like evidence in a much bigger argument about the direction of an entire sport. Caitlin Clark did that in Puerto Rico. And the wildest part is that the biggest shock was not even that she broke records. It was how fast she made it all look normal. 239 days sounds like just a number until you actually sit with it. In basketball terms, it is almost an entire season disappearing. It is the rhythm of competition fading, the timing of every movement drifting just slightly off, and the instincts that once felt automatic needing to be rebuilt under real pressure. It is not just physical absence. It is separation from the speed of the game, from the noise, from the unpredictability that no practice environment can truly recreate. And that is where most comebacks start to fall apart. Because when a player returns after that kind of gap, the first thing you usually notice is hesitation. Not fear exactly, but a split-second delay. The shot that used to come instantly now takes an extra beat. The pass that once felt obvious now comes a fraction too late. The body reacts, but the mind is still catching up. That disconnect is enough to turn elite players into something that looks almost ordinary, at least for a while. And at the highest level, a while can feel like forever. That is why the expectations around this return were so controlled. Coaches did not talk like they were about to unleash a dominant offensive engine. They talked like they were managing a situation, limiting minutes, monitoring reactions, treating the whole thing like a process instead of a moment. And from a traditional standpoint, that made sense. You protect the player. You protect the rhythm of the team. You ease everything back into place instead of forcing it too quickly. But there was something about this situation that did not quite fit that model. Because Caitlin Clark was not coming back from a single, clean injury with a clear recovery timeline. This was not a torn ligament with a defined return date and a predictable progression. This was something messier, a collection of nagging issues that built up over time, layered on top of each other, forcing her away from the game in a way that never felt fully settled. That kind of absence can be even more difficult to come back from, not just physically, but mentally. There is no clean reset. No clear moment where everything is officially behind you. Just a long stretch of waiting, adjusting, and trying to trust that when the opportunity comes, your body and your instincts will still meet you where they used to. And that uncertainty is what makes most players cautious. You see it in how they move. You hear it in how they talk. There is usually a quiet acknowledgement that the first game back is not about dominating. It is about surviving, getting through it, feeling things out, building towards something that might take weeks, maybe even months, to fully return. But Clark never framed it that way. There was no language of hesitation, no subtle lowering of expectations, no attempt to prepare people for a slower version of herself. What came through instead was something much more direct. She trusted the work. She trusted the time she had already put in. And most importantly, she trusted that what made her different before the layoff had not disappeared just because she had been away. That belief changes everything. Because when a player truly believes they have not lost anything, they do not step back into the game cautiously. They step into it ready. Not reckless, but ready. Ready to make reads at full speed. Ready to take shots without overthinking. Ready to move the ball the way they always have, without second-guessing whether the timing is still there. And when that mindset meets actual opportunity, the results can look very different from what everyone expects. Still, belief alone does not guarantee performance. The game has a way of exposing gaps quickly. You can feel confident walking onto the floor, but the first real defensive rotation, the first physical bump, the first moment where everything speeds up, that is when reality usually takes over. That is when the rust shows up. That is when the long layoff becomes visible, not in theory, but in execution. That is what people were waiting to see. Not whether Clark was still talented. That question had already been answered long before this tournament. The real question was whether talent alone could bridge a 239-day gap. Whether the instincts would still fire at the same speed. Whether the decision-making would still be sharp. Whether the flow of the game would still bend in her direction, or whether she would need time to find her place again. Because make no mistake, time away changes how the game treats you. Defenders adjust. Teammates develop new habits. Systems evolve. Even the rhythm of international play can feel different after that long. It is not just about the player returning to the game. It is about the game continuing to move while the player is gone. And when they finally meet again, there is always a moment of recalibration. For most players, that moment is unavoidable. For Clark, it never really showed up. And that is what made the entire situation start to feel unusual even before the numbers came in. There was no visible adjustment phase. No period where she looked like she was testing her limits. No stretch where the game seemed faster than she expected. Instead, everything about her return suggested the opposite. That the time away had not slowed her down mentally. If anything, it had sharpened something. You could see it in the way she approached the opportunity. Not like someone hoping to get through it, but like someone who had been waiting for it. Waiting not just to play again, but to reinsert herself into the flow of competition. Waiting to feel the pace, the pressure, the unpredictability that only real games can provide. There is a difference between wanting to come back and being ready to take over. Clark looked like the second one. And that is where the gap between expectation and reality started to open. Because if you go into a return expecting gradual improvement, you are not prepared for immediate impact. If you build your plan around caution, you are not expecting dominance. And if you treat a player like they might need time, you are not ready for what happens when they clearly do not. That tension was already there before she even checked in. On one side, you had a coaching approach built around patience and control. On the other, you had a player who was mentally operating at full speed the second she stepped back into the environment. And when those two things collide, something has to give. Either the player adjusts to the system, or the system eventually has to adjust to the player. At first, it looked like the player would be the one adjusting. Coming off the bench, limited minutes, a controlled role. Everything about the setup suggested that this would be a slow reintroduction, a careful ramp-up designed to avoid any unnecessary risk. It was a logical plan, a safe plan, the kind of plan that works for most players coming back from long absences. But this was not most players. And the moment she stepped onto the floor, that plan started to look less like strategy and more like a temporary delay. Because within minutes, it became clear that the 239-day gap had not created the kind of limitations people expected. It had not dulled the instincts. It had not slowed the decision-making. It had not reduced the impact. If anything, it made the contrast sharper. A player who had been away from the game that long should not look like the most in-control presence on the floor almost immediately. But she did. And once that happened, the entire conversation shifted. Because now the question was no longer about whether she could return successfully. That part was already answered. The real question became much more uncomfortable for anyone trying to manage expectations. If she can do this after 239 days away, what exactly is the limit? And more importantly, why was she being treated like someone who needed to be eased in when the game itself was already responding to her as if she had never left? That is when the story stopped being about recovery and started becoming about impact. Because the gap did not define her return. What she did next did. The moment she checked in, everything changed. Not gradually. Not over a few possessions. Instantly. You could feel it before the numbers even showed up. The pace shifted. The ball started moving with more purpose. Teammates who had been operating in tight spaces suddenly had room to breathe. Passing lanes opened. Defenders hesitated just a fraction longer, unsure whether to step up or stay back. And in basketball, that fraction of hesitation is everything. That is the part you cannot fake. Because real impact is not just about scoring. It is about control. It is about how quickly a player can impose their rhythm on a game that was already moving without them. And in those first few minutes, Caitlin Clark did not look like someone adjusting to the game. She looked like someone resetting it. Coming off the bench, after 239 days away, she stepped into a live international game and immediately became the most influential presence on the floor. That should not happen, but it did. Her first shot drops. Clean. Confident. No hesitation. And that alone tells you something important. Players coming back from long absences usually take a safer approach early. They test the waters. Maybe they pass up the first open look. Maybe they wait until they feel fully settled before taking control. Clark did the opposite. She took the shot like she had never left. Like the rhythm was already there, waiting for her to pick it back up. And once that first shot fell, everything started to accelerate. Possession after possession, the offense began to orbit around her decision-making. Quick reads. Sharp passes. No wasted movement. She was not just participating in the system. She was directing it. And the difference showed up immediately in how her teammates were able to operate. Cuts were sharper. Spacing was cleaner. Shots came easier. That is what elite playmaking looks like. It is not loud at first. It is subtle. But it changes everything. Then the numbers started coming in. 19 minutes. 17 points. 12 assists. 0 hesitation. That stat line alone would be impressive under normal circumstances. But this was not normal. This was her first real game back in 239 days. This was supposed to be the adjustment period. Instead, it looked like a peak performance. And the most shocking part? It did not look difficult. There was no visible strain. No forced plays. No moments where she looked out of sync. Everything came naturally. The passes were on time. The reads were sharp. The scoring came within the flow of the game. It was efficient, controlled, and almost effortless in the way it unfolded. That is what made people start paying closer attention. Because this was not just about putting up numbers. It was about how quickly she erased the idea of rust. The entire narrative leading into this tournament was built around the assumption that she would need time, that she would need to rebuild her rhythm step by step, that the first game would be more about finding her footing than dominating. That narrative did not survive the first quarter. By halftime, it was already gone. And by the end of her 19 minutes, it was completely irrelevant. What replaced it was something much more difficult to explain. Because when a player returns from that long of a layoff and immediately performs like that, it forces a different kind of conversation. It raises questions about how much of her game is tied to physical rhythm and how much of it is something deeper, something instinctive, something that does not disappear just because she is not playing. You could see it in the way she manipulated the defense. She was not reacting late. She was anticipating, reading angles before they fully developed, delivering passes into spaces that only made sense if you were already thinking one step ahead. That level of vision does not come from recent game reps alone. That comes from a deeper understanding of the game, one that does not fade easily. And that is what made her return feel different from a typical comeback. It did not feel like she was catching up to the game. It felt like the game was catching up to her again. Even her teammates seemed to recognize it in real time. The confidence in their movement changed. They trusted that if they got to the right spot, the ball would find them. And it did, over and over again. That kind of trust builds quickly when the decision-making is that consistent. Defenders, on the other hand, looked caught between choices. Step up too aggressively, and she finds the open player. Stay back, and she has space to shoot. Try to recover late, and the pass is already gone. That is the pressure she creates. Not just with scoring, but with the constant threat of what she might do next. And she was doing all of this in limited minutes. That is what makes the 19-minute detail so important. Because this was not a full-game takeover built on volume. This was efficiency at a level that compresses impact into a much shorter window. She did not need 30 minutes. She did not need extended stretches to build momentum. She stepped in, imposed her presence, and delivered a performance that would have been impressive even if it had come from a fully active player in mid-season form. Instead, it came from someone who had not played in nearly 8 months. That is why people started using words like unreal. Not because they had no other way to describe it, but because it genuinely did not fit the usual patterns. Comebacks are supposed to be gradual. Rust is supposed to show up. Even the best players are supposed to need time. Clark ignored all of that. And the most telling moment might not have been any single play, but the overall feeling by the time she checked out. There was no sense that she had just returned. No sense that this was a player working her way back. The game had already accepted her presence as central, like she had been there the entire time. That is not normal. And once people realized that, the focus shifted again. Because now it was not just about how good she looked. It was about what that performance meant. If she could do this in 19 minutes, what happens with more time? If she could control the game like this immediately, what happens when the system fully runs through her? If she could erase the rust narrative this quickly, what else were people underestimating? Those questions started building fast. But before anyone could fully process them, something else became impossible to ignore. Because as impressive as the performance was, the records were even bigger. The performance was already shocking. But the records are what turned it into something historic. Because once you actually break down what happened in those 19 minutes, it stops sounding like a great game and starts sounding like something the sport had literally never seen before. Start with the assists. 12 assists in a debut game for Team USA's senior national team. Not just women's basketball. Not just recent history. All time. Every player who has ever put on that jersey for the first time, men, women, legends, Hall of Famers, nobody had ever reached that number in their debut. And Clark didn't just break it. She doubled what that standard used to feel like. Think about how many elite guards have come through that program. Think about how many great playmakers have had their first moment on that stage. None of them did what she did. Not in 30 minutes. Not in a full game. Certainly not in 19 minutes off the bench. That alone would have been enough. But it didn't stop there. Because those 12 assists weren't just a Team USA record. They were a global one. The most assists ever recorded by any player, from any country, in their senior national team debut in international competition. That means every nation, every era, every system, every style of play. No one had ever opened their international career like that. Not once. And she did it coming off an 8-month layoff. That's where it starts to feel unreal. Then you zoom out even further. Those 12 assists weren't just impressive for a debut. They were the second highest single-game assist total in the entire history of FIBA qualifying tournaments. Not debut games. Not recent tournaments. All of them. Every game that has ever been played in that environment. Second all time. In her first game. Off the bench. After 239 days away. At that point, it stops being about context. It becomes about scale. Because now you're not just comparing her to other players returning from injury. You're comparing her to the entire history of the competition. And somehow, she's already at the top of that conversation in under 20 minutes. Then comes another layer. Most assists by a bench player in FIBA history. That matters more than people think. Because bench players are not built for that kind of statistical dominance. They play shorter stretches. They operate within tighter roles. They are usually not given full control of the offense. And even when they are effective, their impact is often limited by time and structure. Clark erased that limitation completely. She turned a bench role into a primary engine. And she did it so efficiently that it didn't even feel forced. Then there's the decision-making. 8 assists in the first half. 0 turnovers. That combination is almost impossible at that level. You can have high assists with some mistakes. You can play safe and avoid turnovers with fewer risks. But to create at that volume while maintaining perfect control, that's something even elite point guards struggle to maintain over a full game, let alone in a single half. Clark did it immediately. No adjustment period. No gradual build. Just complete command. And that's when you start to understand why this performance hit so differently. Because it wasn't just one category. It was everything. She wasn't just passing. She was scoring efficiently. She wasn't just scoring. She was controlling tempo. She wasn't just controlling tempo. She was making decisions at a level that eliminated mistakes entirely. Every part of her game showed up at once, as if the 239-day gap had never existed. Then came the milestone that tied it all together. The double-double. Not just any double-double. The fastest double-double ever recorded in a Team USA debut. And more importantly, the first time in history that any player, men or women, any country, had ever recorded a double-double in their senior national team debut. Let that sit for a second. Every great player who has ever stepped onto that stage for the first time. Every legendary debut. Every unforgettable introduction to international basketball. None of them did that. Until now. And again, she did it in 19 minutes. At some point, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Every record she touched wasn't just slightly better than what came before. It reset the expectation entirely. It forced you to rethink what a debut could look like. What a comeback could look like. What a bench role could look like. Because this wasn't incremental. This was disruptive. And that's why the reaction started to shift from surprise to confusion. Because once you stack all of those records together, a new question starts to form. How is this player not starting? How does someone come off the bench, play limited minutes, and still produce the most dominant statistical debut the sport has ever seen? That's where the story starts to turn. Because now it's no longer just about what Clark did. It's about how she was being used. And when those two things don't line up, when the performance clearly exceeds the role, it creates tension. Not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable. A gap between what is happening on the floor and what the system seems prepared to acknowledge. That gap only got wider as the tournament continued. Because night one was just the beginning. And somehow, it still wasn't enough to change her role immediately. This is where the story stops being simple. Because if everything ended with that debut, it would have been easy to explain. A historic return. A record-breaking performance. A clear sign that Caitlin Clark was back at full strength. But what happened next is what turned this into something much more complicated. She didn't move into a bigger role. She stayed on the bench. After one of the most dominant debut performances in international basketball history, after resetting multiple records in just 19 minutes, the decision was not to expand her role immediately, not to hand her control of the offense, not to build around what was clearly working. Instead, the approach stayed the same. Limited minutes, controlled rotation, careful management. And that's where the confusion started. Because at some point, numbers stop being suggestions and start becoming evidence. And the evidence here was overwhelming. Clark wasn't just playing well. She was outperforming everyone on the floor. Not just her team. The entire tournament. She led Team USA in assists. She led Team USA in efficiency. She led Team USA in plus-minus. And not just within her own team. Across every country in the tournament, she was at the top. Now pause for a second and think about what that actually means. A player coming off the bench in most of the games, playing fewer minutes than the primary starters, still producing more total impact than every other player in the entire field. That doesn't happen by accident. That doesn't happen because of one hot stretch. That only happens when the player's influence on the game is fundamentally different. And yet, the role didn't change. That's what made it feel strange. Because the coaching philosophy coming into the tournament was built around balance. Spreading the opportunity. Letting multiple players contribute. Avoiding over-reliance on any single star. On paper, that sounds like a strong approach. It promotes team chemistry. It keeps rotations flexible. It avoids predictable patterns. But there's a limit to how far that philosophy can go. Because when one player is clearly elevating everything around them, balance can start to look like restriction. And that's exactly what this began to resemble. Not a system maximizing its best weapon, but a system trying to contain it. You could see it in the rotations. 5 players in, 5 players out. Short bursts. Quick substitutions. A rhythm that prioritized equality over optimization. And in most situations, that works. It keeps players fresh. It distributes responsibility. It prevents any single player from dominating the ball. But this wasn't most situations. Because every time Clark stepped on the floor, the difference was obvious. The offense flowed better. The spacing improved. The decision-making became sharper. And the scoreboard reflected it. The impact wasn't subtle. It was measurable, immediate, consistent. And still, she kept coming off the bench. That's where the tension really started to build. Not loud, not confrontational, but undeniable. Because now the question wasn't about her performance anymore. That part was settled. The question was about the logic behind the role. What exactly was being protected? What exactly was being preserved? And at what point does managing a player start to look like limiting them? The numbers only made that tension harder to ignore. Despite the reduced minutes, Clark finished the tournament leading in the categories that matter most for overall impact. Points created, assists, efficiency, plus-minus. The metrics that show not just what a player does individually, but how much better the team becomes when they're on the floor. She was at the top of all of them. From the bench. That's not a normal outcome. And when something isn't normal, people start looking for explanations. Some pointed to caution, the long layoff, the desire to avoid pushing too hard too soon. That's a reasonable argument. Health matters. Longevity matters. You don't risk a player's future for one tournament, no matter how important it is. But there's another side to that. Because if the player is already performing at that level, if the movement looks natural, if the decisions are sharp, if the body language shows no hesitation, then the idea of protection starts to feel less convincing. At some point, performance has to influence opportunity. And for most of this tournament, it didn't. That's what made it stand out. Because it created a gap between what everyone could see and what the system was actually doing. Fans saw dominance. Analysts saw control. Teammates felt the difference on the floor. But the rotation didn't fully reflect it. And when that gap exists, it doesn't stay quiet for long. You could feel it in the conversations around the team. Not as criticism, not as outrage, but as curiosity. Why is this happening? What is the long-term plan? And more importantly, what would this team look like if the system fully leaned into what Clark was already proving? Those questions didn't have immediate answers. At least not at first. Because for the early part of the tournament, the structure stayed in place. The rotations stayed controlled. The philosophy stayed consistent. Clark continued to produce at a level that exceeded her role, and the role continued to remain the same, until something finally shifted. And when it did, the difference was impossible to miss. Because the moment the system started to adjust to her, everything changed again. The change didn't come with an announcement. It didn't come with a headline or a dramatic decision, or even a clear moment where everything officially flipped. It came quietly, almost like an adjustment you only notice if you're paying close attention. But once it happened, you couldn't unsee it. Because for the first time in the tournament, the system started to bend toward Caitlin Clark instead of holding her inside it. And the result was immediate. The lineup shifted. The rotations stretched. The ball started living in her hands more consistently. And suddenly, the offense didn't just look good in short bursts anymore. It looked connected, fluid, dangerous in a way that hadn't been fully unlocked in the earlier games. This is where the three-guard lineup changed everything. Clark alongside Paige Buchers and Kelsey Plum created a completely different kind of pressure on the defense. Not just scoring pressure, but decision pressure. Because now every possession had multiple creators, multiple shooters, and multiple threats who could punish even the smallest defensive mistake. But the key to all of it was still Clark. Because when the ball ran through her, the entire structure of the offense shifted. The spacing became more intentional. The pace picked up. The reads became faster. And most importantly, the defense stopped dictating terms. Clark was. You could see it clearly in the Italy game. This wasn't just another win. It was a demonstration. She played extended minutes, and for the first time, it felt like the team was operating in alignment with her strengths instead of around them. The ball moved quickly, but not randomly. Every pass had purpose. Every cut had timing. Every possession built on the last instead of resetting from scratch. And the numbers reflected it. A dominant plus-minus. Efficient scoring. Controlled playmaking. But more than anything, a visible difference in how the entire team functioned when the offense flowed through her. That's what made this shift so important. Because it answered the question that had been building since the first game. What happens when the system fully commits to her? The answer was simple. Everything gets easier. Shots come cleaner. Defenses get stretched. Teammates get better looks. And the game itself starts to feel faster for the opponent and slower for everyone on her side. That's the mark of a true offensive engine. Not just someone who produces numbers, but someone who changes the environment of the game itself. And once that environment changed, it became clear that what she had been doing earlier in the tournament wasn't just impressive. It was incomplete. Because those record-breaking performances had come without the system fully supporting them. They came in shorter stretches, within controlled rotations, without the offense being consistently built around her decision-making. Now that the difference was undeniable. It also forced a quiet acknowledgement. Because when a system changes and immediately improves, it raises an uncomfortable question about the choices that came before it. Not in a dramatic way, not in a critical way, but in a factual one. If this works so clearly now, why wasn't it the approach from the beginning? That question doesn't need an answer to matter. Because the result speaks for itself. The team didn't just win. They looked different. More connected. More confident. More efficient. And far more difficult to guard. The three-guard lineup created spacing that defenses couldn't solve quickly enough. Closeouts came too late. Rotations broke down. And once that started happening, Clark's vision turned those small defensive gaps into consistent scoring opportunities. It wasn't just about what she was doing anymore. It was about what everyone else could do because of her. That's the part that changes how you evaluate a player. Because now you're not just looking at individual stats. You're looking at system impact. You're looking at how much better the entire structure becomes when one player is given the freedom to operate at full capacity. And in this case, the answer was clear. Significantly better. That's why this moment matters more than just one game. Because it showed what Team USA could look like when everything aligned with Clark's strengths. It showed what happens when the offense is built around pace, spacing, and quick decision-making instead of controlled rotations and balanced distribution. It showed a ceiling. And once you see a ceiling like that, it's hard to go back. Even for the coaching staff, there was a recognition that the earlier approach hadn't fully captured what this team could be. Not because it was wrong, but because it wasn't optimized. It didn't fully account for the kind of player Clark is, and the kind of pressure she creates when given consistent control. That realization changed the direction of the tournament. Because from that point on, it wasn't just about winning games. It was about understanding identity. What kind of team are you when your most dynamic player is fully integrated into the system? What kind of offense do you run when you have someone who can manipulate defenses at that level? And how much further can you push things when the structure finally matches the talent? Those questions started to answer themselves on the floor. And as they did, something else became clear. The records weren't slowing down. Because now, with the system finally catching up to her, she had even more room to take over. If night one felt historic, the rest of the tournament made it undeniable. Because what started as a shocking debut didn't fade, didn't slow down, and didn't settle into something normal. It kept building. Game after game, possession after possession. The numbers kept stacking in a way that made it clear this wasn't just one explosive performance. This was a takeover. And the deeper you look into those 7 days, the more extreme it starts to feel. Because now we're not just talking about single-game records anymore. We're talking about sustained dominance across an entire international tournament, against multiple teams, different defensive styles, different game plans, and somehow the impact didn't drop. It expanded. Take the assist record. Before this tournament, the benchmark for elite playmaking in FIBA qualifying sat at 22 total assists across an entire event. That number had held up as the standard, the mark that separated great facilitators from everyone else. Clark passed it. Not barely. Not at the last second. She finished with 32 total assists. That's not just breaking a record. That's redefining it. A nearly 50% increase over what had been considered elite. And again, this wasn't built on playing the most minutes or dominating every possession from start to finish. This came while she was still coming off the bench in most of the games. That's what makes it difficult to compare. Because traditionally, volume stats like that come from players with full control, full minutes, and a consistent starting role. Clark didn't need that. She produced at a level where efficiency replaced volume, where impact didn't depend on time, and where every minute she played carried more weight than usual. Then there's the plus-minus. One game, plus 27. That number alone would stand out in any context. But this wasn't just the best number on her team. It was the highest plus-minus recorded by any player across the entire tournament. Every country, every roster, every game. No one matched it. And that tells you something important. Because plus-minus doesn't just measure individual success. It measures how much better your team performs when you're on the floor. It captures influence. It captures control. It captures the subtle ways a player shifts the balance of the game beyond just scoring or passing. Clark didn't just lead in that category. She separated. And when you combine that with everything else, assists, efficiency, decision-making, you start to see a pattern that goes beyond traditional stats. You're looking at a player who isn't just contributing. You're looking at a player who is consistently tilting outcomes. That's rare, even at the highest level. Then you zoom out to the full tournament picture. Across all 5 games, she led Team USA in the categories that define overall impact. Assists, efficiency, plus-minus, and not just within her own team, but across the entire field. Every player from every country, from the bench. That's what turns this from impressive to historic, because it breaks the usual logic of how performance is supposed to scale. More minutes usually means more production. Larger roles usually mean larger influence. But Clark flipped that completely. She produced more while playing less. She influenced more while being used less. That kind of imbalance doesn't last forever, because eventually the performance forces recognition. And that recognition came as the tournament moved forward. You could see it in the adjustments. You could see it in the trust. You could see it in the way the offense started leaning more heavily into her strengths. The earlier hesitation started to fade, replaced by a clearer understanding of what was actually happening on the floor. And once that understanding settled in, the numbers only became more meaningful. Because now they weren't just surprising. They were expected. That's when you know something has truly shifted. When a performance that would normally shock people starts to feel normal because it's happening repeatedly. When the idea of breaking records stops being the headline and starts becoming part of the routine. That's what these 7 days became. A routine of dominance. And yet, even with all of that, even with the records, the efficiency, the control, there was still one piece missing. One moment that would take everything she had done and elevate it beyond just statistical greatness. Because numbers tell one story. Recognition tells another. And what came next changed how this entire tournament would be remembered. At some point, the numbers stop needing explanation. Because when the gap becomes that obvious, recognition isn't a debate anymore. It's a formality. That's exactly what happened when the tournament ended. Caitlin Clark was named MVP. On the surface, that sounds expected. The best player gets the award. The one with the biggest impact, the most consistent dominance, the clearest influence on winning. That's how it's supposed to work. But this wasn't a normal MVP. This one carried weight. Because this wasn't just about being the best player in the tournament. It was about how she got there. The path itself is what made it historic. Start with the age. She became the youngest player in FIBA qualifying history to win MVP. Not one of the youngest. The youngest. Every tournament before this, every generation of players, every rising star who had stepped onto that stage, none of them reached that level that early. That alone would have been enough to make it special. But then you add the debut factor. This was her first senior national team tournament. And no one had ever won MVP in their debut. Not for Team USA. Not for any country. Think about how unlikely that is. Most players need time to adjust to international play. Different spacing, different rules, different tempo. Even elite players usually spend their first tournament learning, adapting, figuring things out before they fully take over. Clark skipped that phase completely. She went straight from debut to MVP. That has never happened before. Then there's the role. Because MVPs don't come from the bench. They come from starters. From players logging heavy minutes, controlling the game from the opening tip, carrying the weight of the offense across full games. That's how MVPs are built. Through volume, consistency, and visibility. Clark broke that pattern too. She spent most of the tournament coming off the bench, for out of 5 games, and still ended up as the most valuable player. That doesn't just challenge expectations. It breaks them. Because now you're looking at a player who didn't just outperform everyone else. She did it under conditions that should have limited her chances. Less time, less control, less opportunity to build traditional MVP momentum. And none of it mattered. She was still the most impactful player in the tournament. By a clear margin. That's what makes this award different. It wasn't just earned. It was unavoidable. And then there's the part that goes beyond basketball entirely. The audience. This tournament didn't just produce records on the floor. It produced a record off it too. The highest viewership ever for a FIBA qualifying event. More eyes than ever before tuning in to watch a tournament that, historically, didn't always command that level of attention. And the timing of that matters. Because this wasn't random. This wasn't a coincidence. People were watching for one reason. Caitlin Clark's return. That's what changed the scale. Because now you're not just talking about performance inside the game. You're talking about influence outside of it. About how one player can shift attention, drive interest, and pull a broader audience into a space that they might not have engaged with otherwise. That's a different kind of impact. It's not measured in points or assists. It's measured in reach. And that's where this tournament becomes something bigger. Because while Clark was breaking records on the floor, she was also expanding the visibility of the entire event. More viewers, more attention, more conversation. And once those people are watching, they're not just seeing one player. They're seeing everything. They're seeing players like Paige Bueckers scoring efficiently. They're seeing the shooting of Kelsey Plum. They're seeing the depth, the pace, the competitiveness of international women's basketball at a level that maybe they hadn't fully paid attention to before. That's how the impact multiplies. One player draws the attention. The sport keeps it. And that's why this moment matters beyond just one tournament. Because it raises the ceiling. It shows what the audience can be when the right player, at the right time, in the right moment, captures the spotlight. It proves that the interest is there, that the demand exists, that the game has the ability to reach further than it has in the past. Clark didn't just benefit from that. She drove it. And when you combine all of that, the records, the MVP, the age, the debut, the bench role, the viewership, it creates a picture that's hard to ignore. This wasn't just dominance. This was influence. The kind that changes conversations. The kind that shifts expectations. The kind that forces people to rethink what's possible, not just for one player, but for the entire sport. And once you reach that point, the next question becomes unavoidable. What happens next? Once a performance like this happens, it doesn't stay in the past. It carries forward. Because what Caitlin Clark did in Puerto Rico wasn't just about winning games or collecting records. It was a preview, a live demonstration of what happens when her style of play is allowed to fully shape a system. And once you see that clearly, it becomes impossible to ignore what it means moving forward. Start with Team USA. For years, the identity has been built around depth, structure, and balance. Multiple stars. Rotations that spread responsibility. A system that values control as much as creativity. And that approach has worked. It's produced dominance on the international stage. But this tournament introduced something different. It showed what happens when you add a player who doesn't just fit into that structure, but stretches it, speeds it up, forces it to evolve. Because Clark doesn't play at a controlled pace. She plays at a reading pace, a reacting pace, a pace where decisions happen quickly and defenses don't have time to settle. And when the system finally leaned into that, even briefly, the difference was obvious. That raises a bigger question for the future. Do you keep the same structure and fit her into it? Or do you adjust the structure around her and unlock something even more dangerous? Because if Puerto Rico showed anything, it's that the second option has a much higher ceiling. And that's where the Olympic conversation starts to shift. Looking ahead, the idea of who leads Team USA into the next cycle starts to feel less open. Not because of reputation, not because of hype, but because of evidence. Because now there is a real sample of what happens when Clark is on that stage, against international competition, with real stakes. And the result wasn't just success. It was control. By the time the next major tournaments arrive, she won't be the player coming back from a long layoff anymore. She'll be sharper, more experienced, more integrated into the system. And if this version of her could dominate under limited minutes and partial control, the fully unleashed version becomes a much bigger problem for every opponent. That's where things start to feel different. Because now you're not projecting potential. You're projecting continuation. And then there's the Indiana fever. This might be the most immediate impact of all. Because what Clark just demonstrated internationally is exactly what the fever have been trying to build around her. A pace and space offense. Quick decision-making. Ball movement that creates open looks instead of forcing them. And most importantly, a system where her playmaking isn't just part of the offense. It is the offense. Puerto Rico essentially became a blueprint. It showed what works. It showed what doesn't. It showed how much more efficient everything becomes when the ball consistently runs through her and the spacing is designed to support it. And that's something the fever can apply immediately. Push the tempo. Create space. Let her read the game. And build everything else around that. Because once that formula is in place, the rest starts to fall together. Teammates get easier shots. Defenses struggle to keep up. And the entire structure becomes more dynamic, more unpredictable, and harder to stop. That's not theory anymore. That's been tested. And it worked. But the biggest shift might be the one that's hardest to measure. Perception. Because before this tournament, there were still questions floating around. About international fit. About how her style would translate. About whether she could have the same level of control against different systems, different defenses, different pacing. Those questions don't carry the same weight anymore. Not after this. Because now there's proof. Proof that her playmaking translates. Proof that her decision-making scales. Proof that even after 239 days away, she can step into that environment and immediately become the most impactful player on the floor. That changes how people talk about her. And more importantly, it changes how teams prepare for her. Because now she's not just a high-level player with potential. She's a problem that has already shown it can disrupt the highest levels of competition. And that kind of reputation travels fast. Across leagues, across tournaments, across entire systems. So when you zoom out and look at the full picture, the meaning of this tournament becomes clear. It wasn't just a comeback. It was confirmation. Confirmation that the way she plays works everywhere. Confirmation that her impact doesn't depend on perfect conditions. And confirmation that the next phase of her career isn't about proving anything. It's about expanding it. Because if this is what 19 minutes looks like, if this is what limited minutes and a partial system look like, then the fully realized version of Caitlin Clark is something the sport hasn't fully experienced yet. And that's the part that should get everyone's attention. Because this wasn't the peak. This was the starting point. 239 days away. 7 days back. 14 records. 1 MVP. And somehow, that still doesn't fully capture what this was. Because if you only look at the numbers, you miss the bigger picture. You miss the speed of it. The way everything shifted almost instantly. The way expectations collapsed the moment she stepped on the floor. And the way the entire tournament started to orbit around her impact, whether the system was ready for it or not. This wasn't a slow return. It wasn't a cautious rebuild. It wasn't even a typical comeback story. This was a takeover disguised as a return. And that's why it matters. Because moments like this don't just stay in highlight reels. They reshape conversations. They reset expectations. They force teams, coaches, and even entire leagues to adjust to something new. Caitlin Clark didn't just remind people who she was. She reminded them how far ahead the game can move when it runs through her. And now the question isn't whether she can do it again. It's how much bigger it gets from here. If you're watching this and you understand what this moment really means, not just for Clark, but for the future of women's basketball, then you already know this is only the beginning. So if you want more breakdowns like this, real analysis, real stories, and everything happening around the WNBA and beyond, make sure you subscribe to the channel, like this video, and drop a comment below. And don't just comment anything. Comment CC World Record Breaker if you made it all the way to the end. Because if this is what her return looked like, you're going to want to be here for what happens next.